Hi, and welcome to Mr. Hutchings History. I'm Mr. Hutchings. Today's lecture is going to support Unit 4.4, Maritime Empires Maintained and Developed of the AP World History course. Our time period is 1450 to 1750. Our themes are governance, economic systems, humans and the environment, social interactions and organization, and finally, cultural developments and interactions. The historical reasoning skill for this episode will be continuity and change. In a West African griot song, a storyteller laments, "The king sets a hand on everything and says, 'It's not yours anymore.'" Those words capture the transformation of early modern Africa and the wider world during this period. Between 1450 and 1750, European maritime empires linked regions through conquest, commerce, and coercion. The king's drumbeat echoed not only in Africa, but across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. What does it mean to link regions in this era? It meant that trade, labor, and empire became global. Europe's reach connected distant peoples through goods and power, setting the stage for modern globalization under the theme of governance and the skill of continuity and change. The voyages of exploration, first Portuguese, then Spanish, English, French, and Dutch, laid the groundwork for empire. States claimed lands and built trading posts where ships had once stopped only for supplies. From Africa's coasts to Asia's ports, new maritime empires emerged, each reshaping regional politics and economies. What's the difference between exploration and empire? Exploration seeks routes, empire seeks control. This shift marks continuity and change in the theme of governance, from curiosity to colonialization. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Portuguese fleets, funded by Prince Henry the Navigator, mapped the coasts of West Africa and the Indian Ocean. They established fortified trading posts, exchanged enslaved Africans for gunpowder and cannons, empowering coastal kingdoms like the Dahomey and Congo. While some African rulers prospered from this trade, others faced raids and depopulation. Portuguese conquest devastated the Swahili city-states of Kilwa and Mombasa, ending centuries of peaceful commerce. Why would African leaders trade people for weapons? African leaders traded people for European weapons for their own survival and power. European demand for labor reshifted African politics, revealing how economic systems and governance intertwined to sustain empire. While Europeans expanded, Japan and China looked inward. Japan, after initial contact with the Portuguese and Dutch traders, grew alarmed at Christian conversions and foreign interference. By the 1630s, Japan expelled most foreigners, banned overseas travel, and restricted trade to one Dutch outpost at Nagasaki Harbor. In China, the Ming Dynasty, after Zheng He's voyages, China limited foreign trade, destroyed shipyards, and reinforced Confucian order. Later, under the king, China cautiously reopened trade but kept tight imperial control. Why did Japan and China turn away while Europe expanded? They did so to protect their cultural identity and political stability. Both societies saw continuity in governance, choosing order over opportunity. By the mid 1700s, European empires were no longer just exploring, they were colliding. Their ships crossed the same oceans, traded in the same ports, and competed for the same allies. As global commerce grew, so did the stakes. Every colony, every fort, and every trade route had economic meaning. This competition created a world where a conflict in one region could trigger fighting on another continent thousands of kilometers away. Commerce turned the world into a military world. Empires like Britain and France measured power not only by territory but by profit. Who controlled the spice ports of India? Who dominated sugar islands in the Caribbean? Who traded furs in North America? Who secured gold, slaves, and manufactured goods along Atlantic networks? Because wealth fueled armies, navies, and government budgets, economic competition quickly became political competition. When companies and traders clashed, their home governments backed them with soldiers, ships, and weapons. India became the center of European ambition. India was the jewel of global commerce in the 18th century. No place on earth matched its combination of cotton textiles, spices, precious stones, skilled artisans, coastal ports, and a massive consumer market. Two European powers emerged as the main rivals for India. First, the British East India Company, a private company with its own army, navy, and diplomatic service. It operated as a state within the state of Britain. Secondly, were French traders and the French East India Company. The French East India Company was supported by the French crown and allied with various Indian rulers. Both sides, English and French, tried to win over the Mughal Empire, still powerful but weakening. Europeans offered military support to local princes in exchange for trade privileges, rights to collect taxes, or permission to build fortified warehouses. This turned India into a battleground of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. Indian rulers used European companies to fight each other. European companies used Indian rulers to expand their influence. There was a global flashpoint in 1756. In 1756, these overlapping tensions over land and trade routes ignited into a conflict that spread across the world, the Seven Years' War. It was the first war in world history fought on 5 continents. In North America, Britain and France fought over control of the Ohio River Valley and the fur trade. In Europe, Prussia, Austria, Britain, and France battled for continental dominance. In India, British and French companies used local alliances to wage war on the subcontinent of India. In West Africa, forts and slave trading posts changed hands. In the Caribbean, sugar islands, some of the world's richest territories, were attacked and captured. For students, the key idea is simple. A war started by companies became a war of empires. By 1763, Britain emerged with decisive gains, and it gave birth to a global empire. In India, France lost almost all political influence. The British East India Company became the dominant power and later established direct British rule. In North America, France lost Canada and its Mississippi territories. In the Caribbean, Britain captured profitable sugar islands, increasing its wealth even further. This gave Britain unmatched global reach, control of the Atlantic trade, Indian markets, and major naval routes. Historians often see 1763 as the birth of the first modern global empire. Why did global wars begin as commercial rivalries? Global wars began as commercial rivalries because empire was built on economics. European powers fought for trade routes, markets, and profitable colonies. Control of commerce meant wealth, and wealth meant political influence and military strength. These patterns show how economic systems linked to governance, revealing continuity in the long standing competition for resources. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they stepped into continents filled with powerful states, advanced cities, and millions of people. Yet within a few decades, two relatively small Iberian kingdoms, Spain and Portugal, took control of huge territories. This transformation reshaped the world. There is the catastrophe of disease and demographic collapse in the Americas. Before conquest came disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread faster than European armies could travel. Indigenous peoples had no immunity to these old world pathogens. Mortality rates reached 50 to 90% in some regions. Entire villages were emptied. Rulers, administrators, and priests died, creating a political vacuum in these indigenous societies. European conquest was built on this demographic disaster. By the time armies arrived, many societies were struggling to recover. There was the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires. We'll begin with Cortez and the Aztecs. In 1519, Hernan Cortez entered the Aztec Empire with a tiny army. He succeeded not because of superior numbers, but because he understood how to use indigenous rivals who already opposed Aztec rule, firearms and cavalry, epidemic disease, which struck Tenochtitlan during his siege. In 1521, Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, fell. Its temples were destroyed, and the Spanish built Mexico City over its ruins. Now let's move to Pizarro and the Inca. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro captured Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, after luring him into what he claimed was a peaceful meeting. Atahualpa was executed, and Spanish forces soon controlled the empire. But the Inca collapse was not simply military. Smallpox had already killed the previous emperor and thrown the Inca Empire into civil war. Pizarro stepped into a society already destabilized. There was a new economic core of silver, sugar, and forced labor. Conquest opened access to enormous wealth. Let's begin with sugar. The mines of Potsi in modern day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico produced mountains of silver, literally. Spain used forced indigenous labor through systems like the mita, adapted from Inca tradition. This silver flowed across the Atlantic and into Asia, fueling global trade with China and linking the world economy. There was sugar and slavery. Portugal, using Brazil, expanded sugar plantations using enslaved African labor. Spain soon adopted similar plantation systems in the Caribbean. And there was urban transformation. Indigenous capitals became colonial capitals. Tenochtitlan became Mexico City. Cuzco became a regional Spanish center in South America. Spanish churches, plazas, and administrative buildings replaced indigenous temples and palaces, reflecting new governance and cultural priorities. Now let's move to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the world. The sudden wealth of the New World created rivalry between Spain and Portugal. To prevent war, the Pope issued a division of the world. Spain received lands west of the line, which was most of the Americas. Portugal received lands east of the line of Tordesillas. The line was drawn in a way that gave Brazil to Portugal. This division shows how papal authority acted as a political force equal to kings and empires. Religious power shaped global geography. Why did two small nations dominate so much land? Spain and Portugal were not the largest European kingdoms. They did not have the most soldiers, but they had two main advantages. First, maritime technology. Both kingdoms developed caravels, lateen sails, navigational schools, started by Prince Henry the Navigator, improved cartography, and knowledge from Islamic and Mediterranean sailors. This allowed them to reach and return from the Americas long before other European states had ocean going experience. The second advantage was papal support and religious justification. The Catholic Church endorsed Iberian expansion. They endorsed the expansion through the Treaty of Tordesillas, through missionizing orders such as the Jesuits, Dominicans, and Franciscans, and through the belief that spreading Christianity justified conquest. Religion provided moral and political cover for imperial expansion. So again, why did two small Iberian nations dominate so much land? It's because Spain and Portugal dominated early as they had advanced maritime technology and strong support from the Catholic Church. Papal authority gave them the right to claim new territories, while ships and navigators gave them the ability to reach them. This shows continuity in how religious justification supported conquest and marks a major change in global power as Atlantic kingdoms rose to dominate world affairs. European armies did not grow rich through their own hard work. They grew rich by controlling other people's labor. When Europeans built colonies in the Americas, they did not invent new systems from scratch. Instead, they took older labor traditions, indigenous tribute, Inca Mita, African slavery, Mediterranean plantation models, and reshaped them into global engines of profit. Empire was powered by labor, but most of the labor came from people who had no choice. Let's speak of the encomienda system, which turned tribute into exploitation. Spanish conquerors wanted control of land, but even more importantly, they wanted control of people. Under encomienda, the Spanish crown granted settlers the right to use indigenous labor in return for the promise of protection and Christian instruction. In theory, this was supposed to resemble tribute systems that indigenous states already used. But in practice, it looked like this. Indigenous men and women worked long hours. They farmed, mined, or built for Spanish encomenderos. Payment was often inadequate or non existent. Families were separated. Disease and overwork caused devastating mortality. Encomienda collapsed quickly because it was so brutal and unsustainable, but it established a pattern. European wealth came from coerced indigenous labor. Now, the hacienda system, which was coercion wrapped in land ownership. As encomienda declined, Spanish elites created the hacienda, a large estate similar to a plantation. Haciendas produced wheat, maize, livestock, and regional goods for local markets. Labor was still coerced, but it was more subtle. Workers became indebted to landowners. Debt bound families to estates for generations. Landowners held legal and economic power. This system blurred the line between free and unfree labor. People were not owned, but they could not leave, a different form of control. Haciendas show continuity from medieval feudalism, with landowners extracting wealth from laborers tied to their estates. And now the Mita, an indigenous institution rewired for empire. Before the Spanish arrived, the Inca Empire used the Mita, a rotational labor service owed to the state. Communities served the empire by building roads, maintaining terraces, serving in the military. It was communal, temporary, and tied to local tradition. The Spanish took this familiar system and transformed it into a mining draft for silver. Under the colonial Mita, Andean men were forced to work in deadly conditions at mines like Potsi in Bolivia, Zacatecas in Mexico. Workers faced toxic mercury vapors, collapsing mine shafts, freezing temperatures at high altitudes, and exhaustion from 12-hour shifts. The colonial mita was no longer communal service, it was forced labor for empire. It produced enormous wealth at unimaginable human cost. Now, chattel slavery, when people became property. Chattel slavery was the most extreme form of labor exploitation. In this system, enslaved Africans were legally considered property. They could be bought, sold, inherited, and punished without rights. African families were separated. Violence enforced obedience. Millions of Africans died during the Middle Passage or under plantation labor. This system grew because sugar, tobacco, and later cotton demanded massive labor forces. On sugar plantations, enslaved workers produced wealth faster and more cheaply than any other system. Chattel slavery was not new, but its scale, racialization, and global economic impact were unprecedented in world history. Finally, silver mining, financing a global empire. The greatest treasure of the Spanish Empire came from silver, not gold. At Potsi and Zacatecas, miners, many drafted through the colonial mita, pulled thousands of tons of silver out of the earth. This silver filled Spain's treasury, paid for European wars, bought goods in Asia, especially Chinese silk and porcelain, fueled global trade across the Pacific via Manila galleons. Spanish claimed the wealth, but indigenous and African laborers created it. I'd like to discuss mercantilism, colonies that served the mother country. European governments used a policy called mercantilism, which assumed wealth is finite, nations grow strong by controlling trade, and colonies exist to enrich the home country. Under mer- Strawberries. Under mercantilism, silver flowed to Spain, sugar and tobacco flowed to Europe, manufactured goods flowed back to colonies. Enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic to maintain colonial production. Labor, not land, not gold, was the real engine of empire. How did Europe's wealth depend on labor it didn't perform? Europe's wealth depended on systems of coerced labor, from the encomienda in Mexico to the mita in the Andes to chattel slavery in the Caribbean and Brazil. These systems extracted labor from indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, producing silver, sugar, and other goods that enriched Europe. Under the theme of economic systems, labor became the global currency of empire. Coerced work is one of the greatest continuities in world history. From the 1500s to the 1800s, the Atlantic slave trade became one of the largest forced migrations in human history. More than 12 million African men, women, and children were captured, sold, and transported across the ocean against their will. This brutal system reshaped Africa, the Americas, and Europe, creating a global economy built on human suffering. Most enslaved people were not captured by Europeans themselves, but through raids by African armies, warfare between African states, kidnapping along trade routes, and village level conflicts exploited for profit. Captives were marched, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, to the coast. They were then held in fortified trading posts known as slave castles, including Elmina and Cape Coast in modern Guyana, and Goree Island off the coast of Senegal. These places still stand today, reminding us that the transatlantic slave trade unfolded in real, physical spaces that can be studied and visited. Inside the forts, conditions were so harsh that many died before ever reaching the ocean. Crossing the Africa to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage, was once one of the most horrific experiences in world history. People were chained in extremely tight spaces. Oxygen ran low. Disease spread rapidly. Food and water were limited. Violence from crew members was constant. Death rates varied, but on some voyages, up to half of the captives died. Even on successful journeys from the perspective of slave traders, mortality was shockingly high. The ship itself became a symbol of dehumanization, people reduced to cargo. Contrary to popular assumptions, North America received only 6% of enslaved Africans. The majority were transported to Brazil, nearly 40%. Brazil's sugar plantations were enormous, labor intensive, and deadly. Enslaved Africans were forced to cut cane, feed boiling furnaces, and process sugar for export. Life expectancy was tragically low. The Caribbean received over 40% of the slaves. Islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint Domingue, now Haiti, became one of the wealthiest colonies on earth, powered by enslaved labor. This region had the harshest slave codes and highest turnover rates. Slaves were also sent to Spanish America, Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico, Peru. Enslaved Africans worked in silver mines, ranching, urban trades, and domestic labor. North America received about 5% of the slave trade. The U.S. slave population grew through childbirth rather than constant imports, which is why fewer people were shipped there compared to Brazil or the Caribbean. There was African resistance and African losses. African leaders and communities responded in many ways to the slave trade, resisting, negotiating, or trying to control the trade themselves. One famous example is King Afonso I of Congo, who wrote to the King of Portugal begging him to stop illegal slave raids in his kingdom. His requests were ignored. The demographic impact on Africa was severe. Millions of young men were removed. Some regions experienced population decline. Polygyny increased because fewer adult men remained. Families and lineages were fractured. Warfare intensified as states fought for captives to sell. Africa's political landscape changed dramatically as trade reorientated local communities toward capturing and selling people rather than producing goods. Now, I'd like to move to the plantation system and why enslaved labor became central, not peripheral, to world history and trade. The key to understanding the Atlantic system is simple. Plantations needed labor, and enslaved Africans were the backbone of that labor. Europeans relied on enslaved Africans because sugar, tobacco, rice, and later cotton required enormous labor. Indigenous populations in the Caribbean and Brazil had collapsed from disease. Enslaved Africans brought agricultural and metallurgical skills. Europeans relied on enslaved Africans because sugar, tobacco, rice, and later cotton required enormous labor. Indigenous populations in the Caribbean and Brazil had collapsed from disease. Enslaved Africans brought agricultural and metallurgical skills. European settlers did not want to perform plantation work themselves. Profits depended on forced labor. Without it, the colonial economy would collapse. A global trade. Europe made manufactured goods. Africa supplied enslaved people. The Americas produced sugar, tobacco, coffee, silver, and cotton. This triangle of exchange created wealth for Europe, transformed the Americas, and devastated Africa. So again, why did slavery become central to empire, not peripheral? Slavery became central because plantation economies depended on massive labor forces. Enslaved Africans created the wealth, sugar, silver, tobacco, and later cotton that powered European empires. This system linked Africa, Europe, and the Americas in an unequal triangle. Under the AP themes of economic systems and social interactions, Coerced labor became the foundation of global wealth. In the Indian Ocean, old Muslim, Hindu, and Chinese merchants adapted to European intrusion. Portuguese warships enforced tolls, but commerce continued through traditional partnerships. Meanwhile, Spain's silver from the Americas connected to China's markets, creating a single world economy. Was this a new global system or an old one extended? It was both. Continuity lay in trade, change lay in who controlled it. The shift from regional to maritime dominance defines this era's transformation. Despite violence and coercion, this age produced cultural fusion. African rhythms, foods, and languages shaped the Americas. Asian luxury goods transformed European taste. Missionaries spread Christianity, but also preserved local art and languages. Can cultural exchange occur under coercion? Yes, but unequally. Even under oppression, people adapted and reshaped identity, reflecting cultural interaction amid empire. Let's use our historical thinking. Apply continuity and change to this lesson. The continuities: maritime trade, coerced labor, and religious mission. The changes: global integration, demographic shifts, and political dominance by Europe. Which had greater impact, continuity or change? I would say change. The rise of maritime empires ended isolation forever, connecting all regions in a single interdependent system. From West Africa's lament to the silver mines of Potosi, the story of maritime empires is one of human ambition and human cost. The world's regions were linked, not as equals, but as participants in a vast new web of power. When power crosses oceans, who owns the world's future? One answer is those who navigate it. But history reminds us that every voyage leaves a wake. I'm Mr. Hutchings, and thank you for listening to this Mr. Hutchings history episode. I enjoy doing these very much, and I hope you enjoy listening and sharing these. Until next time, stay curious. History matters.